He took a life at 19. He received a life sentence. He was released after 23 years. 2 years later, he was imprisoned again for crimes committed before his first arrest. Another 2 years later, he was free again. The circle was complete. Everyone who knew Sonia Foresight well was constantly amazed at how this girl combined beauty and intelligence. Nature had gifted her generously. Her intellect was developed far beyond her years. Her maturity of thought set her apart from her peers to such an extent that it sometimes seemed out of place at such a young age. At the same time, her character remained surprisingly gentle and sentimental. She preferred the warmth of her family home to noisy teenage parties. A short separation from her family was enough to overwhelm Sonia with sadness. She lived in the northern part of Belfast, in Northern Ireland. The girl's mother, Audrey, had started a life with a new partner in the early 90s. Her relationship with Sonia's biological father had ended by then. Besides Sonia, there was another, younger daughter in the family from Audrey's previous union. The four of them lived on Sydney Street West. It was a quiet, calm neighborhood. People knew each other by sight and greeted each other on the streets. Local shops, familiar faces behind the counters. Sonia's looks prompted her mother to enroll her daughter in a modeling school. Audrey believed the girl could build a career in this field or a related one. She saw how Sonia carried herself in front of the camera, how easily she smiled without being self-conscious. Although the girl was a homebody, she had friends. She made acquaintances easily but kept her social circle small, only trusted people. On weekdays and weekends, Sonia often went out to meet them and have fun, but she never stayed out late. She never stayed overnight at friends' houses, not even when invited. Early in the morning on June 30, 1991, Sonia went to her friend's house. She had arranged with her parents to be home for dinner. She appeared around 6 in the evening, had dinner with everyone, and then went out again around 7, promising to be back quickly. Audrey remembers her daughter waving from the doorstep, a normal gesture, a normal evening. It seemed the Forsyth family had no reason to worry. Their neighborhood had always been quiet and calm, with no crime. Neighbors left bicycles by their entrances, and young people played outside until dark. But this dinner would be the last one they shared with Sonia. The summer evening stretched on slowly. The light lingered, the air was warm, and voices could be heard from the street. Sonia was supposed to return soon. She was only planning to be at her friend's for a couple of hours. The appointed time passed. The girl still wasn't back. At first, Audrey just glanced at the clock. Then she went to the window. The street was empty. The mother immediately felt a sense of anxiety, though she didn't panic. Breaking promises was completely out of character for her daughter. Responsibility was one of her main traits. Audrey started calling the friends Sonia might have gone to see. The first number, the second, the third. Sonia was nowhere to be found. The girls answered in surprise. No, she hadn't come over, hadn't called, hadn't said anything. Several more hours passed. It was completely dark outside. Audrey could no longer contain her anxiety. She contacted the police, reporting her daughter missing. Her voice trembled as she described the clothes: black jeans, a burgundy jumper, white boots. The officers on duty tried to calm her with standard phrases. The girl would turn up any minute. She was probably just hanging out with friends and lost track of time. The woman dismissed all these arguments. She insisted this behavior was completely atypical for Sonia. She wasn't just worried, she knew. A mother's intuition that cannot be deceived by words. She felt that something serious had happened. Fortunately, she managed to convince the police. The search began that same night, though their options were limited in the dark. Streetlights only illuminated parts of the streets, leaving yards in shadow. The operation only reached full capacity in the morning, at dawn.
The area where the Forsyths lived was compact. Residential blocks, apartment buildings, narrow streets. Rumors spread like wildfire. One neighbor told another, who told another, and by lunchtime the whole street knew. Besides, many in the area knew Sonia by sight, a pretty girl with dark hair, always polite.
Plus, crime here was minimal, so the disappearance of this person instantly became the main topic of conversation for all the locals. On one hand, this threatened a flood of speculation and possible false leads that could steer the investigation in the wrong direction. Someone might remember something that didn't happen, or mistake another girl for Sonia. On the other hand, it offered the possibility that witnesses with genuinely valuable information would contact the station. Someone might have seen something, heard something, noticed a detail. Despite the risks, the family decided to involve the local press. Sonia's disappearance made the front pages. Audrey provided a picture of her daughter. In the photo, Sonia was smiling, looking directly at the camera, and also described in detail the clothes she was wearing when she left home on the evening of June 30th, 1991. Shoulder-length dark hair, brown eyes, black jeans, a burgundy jumper, white boots. Her appearance was memorable. It seemed this should help. However, almost no useful information came in. The local community learned about the incident almost instantly, but there were very few responses. People read the newspapers, discussed it in their kitchens, but didn't go to the police. The residents were scared. If something like this could happen here in a quiet neighborhood, it meant no one was safe. The passivity was so pronounced that by July 18th, investigators openly voiced concerns for the missing girl's safety. These words were stated officially at a press conference. The detectives stood before the cameras, choosing their words carefully, but the meaning was clear. Time was passing, and the chances were fading. But even this did not move the case forward. All leads were checked. Some people called, some came in person, but nothing substantial was found. Her loved ones categorically rejected the theory of her running away. Sonia had no conflicts in her family. Audrey repeated this to the detectives again and again, combing through her memories of the last few days, the last conversations. She had a warm relationship with her mother, sister, and stepfather. The girl didn't argue, didn't slam doors, didn't leave with clenched fists. She had a non-confrontational nature and no inclination to run away. Nothing like this had ever happened before that fateful day, June 30th. This circumstance was strange for a disappearance situation, but allowed for hope that the girl was okay. Maybe someone had deceived her. Maybe she was lost somewhere, not knowing how to get back. Maybe. The police became finally convinced of this when Audrey told them, shortly before the events, she had bought her daughter a whole new wardrobe. Dresses, skirts, blouses. Sonia hadn't even really tried them on yet. However, she never got to wear them. The clothes hung in the closet untouched, with the tags still on. Clearly, she hadn't been planning to run away. The mother, anxiously awaiting any news, shared everything she knew with the investigators. Sometimes she would repeat the same things, trying to recall some detail she might have missed. The detectives combed through Sonia's immediate circle, methodically from a list. They questioned everyone in the teenager's close circle, friends, relatives, classmates. They recorded testimonies, compared versions. No one had any idea what had happened. They all said the same thing. Sonia was not the type to just disappear. The friends she was supposed to visit after dinner claimed she never arrived. They waited, looked out the window, and then decided her plans must have changed. No one had mobile phones back then, so there was no way to track her location. No messages, no calls, no trace on the airwaves. The girls had simply walked around together before dinner and then gone to their respective homes. They hadn't seen each other since. Their words were confirmed by other witnesses, those who saw the group of girls during the day before Sonia went home for dinner.
Except for clarifying the timeline, this information provided nothing new. Sonia left her house around 7 in the evening and vanished. By July, they began to suspect Sonia had been taken. Investigators used the word cautiously, but it hung thick in the air. However, the family received no ransom demands. The phone was silent. The mailbox was empty. The more time passed, the less hope remained of finding the girl unharmed. A special task force was formed from the most experienced detectives and officers, people with long service records, with instincts. They primarily selected those familiar with abduction cases, who knew how kidnappers think, where to look, what to ask. Several search parties, dozens of volunteers, local residents who couldn't sit idly by, and even dog handlers with trained dogs scoured the city. The dogs pulled on their leashes, sniffing the ground, the grass, the corners of buildings. There were no results. The searched area was expanded. Now, in addition to the streets of Belfast, they were checking the suburbs and neighboring districts. The map on the station wall became covered with pins. Searched here, passed through here, nothing here. During this period, several more official statements were made. Law enforcement officers were convinced Sonia hadn't run away on her own. She had been taken. They said this now without reservations. By July 19th, the police had a curious new theory. Shortly before the girl's disappearance, Belfast's marching bands had begun to gather for a small themed tour of Scotland. Musicians, drums, flags, a vibrant spectacle that drew crowds. According to her family, Sonia had always shown a keen interest in them. She would stop to watch rehearsals and linger when the bands marched through the streets. On the day of her disappearance, about 60 marching bands set off to Scotland to participate in a music festival. A ferry, a crossing, crowds of people on the pier. They speculated that Sonia might have gone with them, impulsively, without thinking, caught up in the moment. It was strange that the girl hadn't told anyone and had left without any belongings, but everyone clung to this theory as a last straw. At least it was something. By the time this theory emerged, most of the musicians had already returned home. They were questioned right at the pier, shown the photograph. Sonia was not among them. No one remembered a girl with dark hair. No one had seen her on the ferry. The remaining bands were expected to arrive in the coming days. Audrey imagined her daughter somewhere in Scotland, perhaps scared, not knowing how to get back, afraid of being punished. In addition to the teenagers' keen interest in marching bands, Scotland at that time was a real magnet for young people due to its numerous concerts and music events, an atmosphere of celebration, crowds, freedom. Although such an act was uncharacteristic for the girl, her mother waited hopefully for the ferry's return from Scotland. According to detectives, it was the last one the missing girl could have been on. Search teams monitored all approaches to the port, checking arriving people. They stood with photographs, scrutinizing the faces of those disembarking. Unfortunately, their hopes were dashed. Sonia was not on that ferry. Passengers disembarked, collected their bags, and dispersed, and among them was not someone with dark hair. Nevertheless, the rumor that the teenager had run away from her family to have fun in Scotland was eagerly picked up by the public. People preferred this version. It was softer, safer than the thought of an abduction. In the following days, several witnesses contacted the police station. People claimed to have seen a girl very similar to Sonia's description in a Scottish seaside town about 20 kilometers from Belfast. She was standing by a shop, or walking down the street, or sitting on a bench. The details were hazy, but everyone was certain. The Foresight family and the police once again felt a flicker of hope that the girl was safe. These leads were checked. People were sent to the location, locals were questioned, photographs were shown. but no evidence for the theory was found. The detectives couldn't even confirm that Sonia had ever been in that area. Not a single shopkeeper, not a single passerby recognized her from the picture. The search team continued to comb through areas of Northern Ireland. On July 23, the operations leader announced that the Shankill, Woodvale, and Old Park areas had been completely searched, but this had yielded no new leads. He listed the names of the districts, marked them on the map, put check marks next to them. It was as if Sonia had vanished into thin air. During the same period, a campaign was launched to put up posters in various districts of Belfast. Volunteers walked around with rolls of paper, glue, and stepladders. Sonia's face looked out from lampposts, shop walls, and notice boards. Unfortunately, this also brought no valuable information. People looked, shook their heads, and walked past. Agonizing weeks of silence turned into months of waiting and anxiety. Audrey had to somehow continue existing, not knowing what had happened to her eldest daughter. Waking up her younger one, making breakfast, going to the shop, ordinary actions that now seemed meaningless. During this period, the mother focused on the younger one to distract herself somehow. She played with her, read her books, put her to bed. Of course, it helped very little. Her thoughts always returned to Sonia. Despite no information about Sonia, even by January 1992, the woman still hoped her daughter was safe and had simply run away. She clung to that thought. During another television appearance, cameras, bright lights, microphones, Audrey confessed that she had the same nightmare almost every night. The detective leading the search knocks on her door and then asks her to come and identify someone who has been found. She said this quietly, haltingly, with pauses. Potential witnesses remained silent. There were not even false leads for the search, just silence. The phone didn't ring, no one knocked on the door, no one made contact. The mother hoped that for the Christmas holidays she would receive a card or a letter where her daughter would tell her where she was and what had happened to her. She checked the mailbox every day, sometimes twice. She would open it, look inside, empty. However, these hopes were also not realized. Finally, in the last days of January 1992, new information emerged. Parents came to the police station with someone who was not yet an adult, whose name was not disclosed for security reasons. She came with her mother, spoke quietly, and looked at the floor. She stated that she had been a victim of a network of people who harmed those in vulnerable positions. The report triggered one of the largest investigations into the mistreatment of those in vulnerable positions ever conducted in the history of Northern Ireland. The victim revealed that there were several houses in the Belfast area constantly used for terrible acts against those who couldn't protect themselves. She struggled to recall the addresses, getting the numbers mixed up, but eventually a list was compiled. She named several adult men involved in a whole series of crimes. This had been going on for about the last year and a half. The time frame coincided with the period of Sonia's disappearance. One of the houses the victim described was located just a couple of 100 meters from where the story's heroine was supposed to meet her friends, literally around the corner in the next block. According to several witnesses, they had seen her there that evening, or someone who looked very similar. When detectives arrived and conducted searches, they found numerous photographs of girls in compromising situations. The pictures were in drawers, folders, some carelessly scattered on the table, as well as other evidence that corroborated the victim's story. A man was arrested on charges of seriously harming two individuals. He was taken away in handcuffs as neighbors peeked out of their windows, exchanging glances. The suspicion that he had made a business of harming those in vulnerable positions was not confirmed. The other individuals involved in the case were checked, interrogations, alibis, witnesses, and released. The arrested man's possible involvement in Sonia Forsyth's disappearance was thoroughly investigated. He was questioned directly, shown her photograph, and pressed for answers. The crimes of the man who harmed those in vulnerable positions became even more high profile than Sonia's disappearance. Newspapers were filled with headlines, and television broadcast reports. It was believed that the girl could have also been a victim of these criminals. The theory seemed logical. One of the convicted man's neighbors claimed to have seen the missing girl walking near his house on that fateful day. She remembered because she had noticed the girl, pretty, walking alone. It was getting dark. However, the time she mentioned did not match the time of the girl's disappearance. The neighbor had seen her earlier during the day when Sonia was returning from her walk with friends. She couldn't confirm that Sonia was there in the evening on the day she disappeared. The suspicions were investigated.
Despite all the detectives' efforts, a link to Sonia Foresight's case could not be established. There wasn't enough evidence. Testimonies were vague. Nothing added up. The investigation was back to square one. The agonizing months for Audrey turned into years. Life went on, but as if in slow motion, in a fog. It wasn't until 1996 that there was a breakthrough. In March, the law enforcement officers assigned to the case announced they had decided to take a fresh look at the missing girl's case. They pulled up the archives, dusty folders, yellowed pages, old photographs, and the scant evidence was reanalyzed. They sought out old witnesses, calling them, visiting them, talking to them. One of the reasons for the authorities' increased activity was new DNA analysis techniques that were previously unavailable. Technology had advanced, creating new possibilities. It was believed that something important might have been missed during the initial searches, and now it could be checked. Certain traces could be re-examined. On March 19, 1996, around 1 in the morning, the Belfast Emergency Services received a call. The voice on the line was trembling. A frightened witness reported a fire that had started in one of the apartments in a complex on a street located a couple of 100 meters from the Forsyths' home. The fire alarmed all the local residents. People ran out into the street in their dressing gowns and slippers, some carrying those who couldn't walk on their own. They watched in horror as the events unfolded. Windows glowed orange, thick black smoke billowed out. Within minutes, the fire brigade arrived. Sirens shouted commands, the sound of water. They managed to contain the fire before it spread to neighboring buildings. In reality, no one was injured, and the damage from the incident was minimal. Interestingly, after inspecting the apartment, the firefighters concluded it was not an accidental fire, but likely arson. Traces of flammable liquid, the way the fire had spread, everything pointed to deliberate intent. None of the neighbors were harmed, but the walls were scorched. Black streaks, blistered paint, the smell of burning. The floor was filled with smoke. After the fire services work, repairs were needed, but that was the extent of the damage. The property was rented out. The owners were notified of the incident. A call in the middle of the night woke them up. The next day, they arrived to assess the damage, repair the apartment, and continue renting it out. They didn't know where the tenant was. His phone wasn't answering, and he didn't open the door. Overall, nothing extraordinary had happened. The decor and some furniture needed replacing, just the usual work after a minor incident. During this routine work, the owners decided to inspect the entire property to check if anything else had been damaged. They noticed an old coal bunker located in the far part of the courtyard. A small structure that hadn't been used for a long time. From the outside, everything looked normal. The door was closed, the walls intact. However, they noticed that in an inconspicuous spot in a corner of the bunker, there was a rolled-up carpet, dusty, darkened. This item belonged to the property owners but had gone missing long ago. They had even forgotten about it. So they decided to take it and clean it up before putting it back on the floor in the apartment. When they unrolled the carpet, they realized it had been a bad idea. The smell hit them first, heavy, sweetish,
unbearable. Inside was something that should never have been there, and it was a very distressing sight. Everything was in a very poor condition due to the time that had passed. One of the owners stepped back, the other froze. Then someone ran out into the street, someone else grabbed the phone. Law enforcement was immediately called to the scene, and they took the discovery for a forensic examination.
The area was cordoned off, and crime scene investigators began their work. It was immediately obvious that this was the result of a terrible act. There were signs of severe head injuries. The harm had been forceful and numerous. Someone had acted again and again without stopping. After the examination, it was confirmed. This was what remained of the missing Sonia Foresight. The DNA matched the parents' samples. By comparing the time of disappearance with the information the landlords had, they figured out that at the time of the girl's disappearance, a man named James Craig lived there. More precisely, in 1991, he was 19. Quiet, polite, he worked in his mother's shop. He had no trouble with the law, at least not until that moment. Neighbors had nothing bad to say about him. He was tracked down in England. The young man had fled to Liverpool, presumably right after setting fire to the rented apartment. His trail had gone cold for almost 5 years. On April 2, police went there to arrest him. They found him at his address and knocked early in the morning. Detectives learned that during the period of Sonia Forsyth's disappearance, he had lived in that apartment and also worked in a nearby shop. The shop belonged to his mother, a small store that sold cigarettes, candy, and other small items. James did not admit guilt. He spoke calmly, looked them in the eye, and answered questions without hesitation. So the investigators talked to the neighbors and the owners of the rental property. They provided valuable information. One of the neighbors said that on the night of Sonia's disappearance, she saw a girl who looked like her come to this young man's place. They were standing by the entrance, talking and smoking on the street. The woman remembered the scene because it struck her as odd. Due to the significant age difference, the pair looked very unusual, a grown man and a teenage girl. So the woman watched them for a long time from her kitchen window. She saw them talking, laughing, saw James take out cigarettes and offer one to the girl. Then she saw through the window as the girl went into James's apartment. Through the window, the neighbor noticed the young people sit down on the sofa and talk. The girl looked calm, not scared. What happened in the apartment later remained a mystery, at least for that moment. A few minutes later, James got up, walked to the window, and drew the curtains. A normal action, but the neighbor remembered it. After that, she saw nothing. Other neighbors stated that for years they had smelled an unpleasant odor but couldn't find its source. Some mentioned a smell from the basement, others from the ventilation. They assumed a faulty sewage system or bad water pipes were to blame. A plumber was called several times. The tradesman would come, inspect the pipes, check the system, but could never figure out where the bad smell was coming from. He would shrug his shoulders, leave, and the smell would remain. People simply didn't know the specific smell of what remained hidden. This allowed it to stay concealed until it had almost completely deteriorated. Years passed, and the smell became a familiar background noise that they stopped noticing. James Craig had spoken with the police on several previous occasions. He had been called in for questioning back in 1991, and then again in 1996. Each time he insisted he was not involved, had never smelled any unpleasant odor, and had no idea what had happened to Sonia Forsyth. He spoke convincingly, without a tremor in his voice, without nervousness. The leadership of the local police station found out that for 2 weeks after the teenager's disappearance, a search team had passed through and searched the grounds of that building. It was unclear how they could have missed such a sharp, specific smell. Why they couldn't find what was wrapped in a carpet, lying just a few dozen meters from the entrance. Trying to explain how they could have missed the discovery, the head of the search team reported,
At that stage, when the houses and surrounding area were being searched, everyone thought Sonia was still safe, so they weren't looking for anything like that. They were looking for someone who was okay, in basements, in attics, around corners of houses. They simply didn't pay attention to the smell, taking the young man at his word. He said he didn't smell anything, and they believed him. Perhaps the smell wasn't that strong yet, although this sounded doubtful. It was summer, when deterioration happens fastest. July, heat, what was hidden in an enclosed space. The apartment and the area around the buildings were searched several times. They came in groups, with dogs, with flashlights.
Detectives even spoke with James Craig personally. He admitted to seeing Sonia on the evening she disappeared. They had smoked together, talked. The neighbor had also already made a statement that she had seen the missing girl at his entrance, but for some reason, no one paid serious attention to it. It was noted in the report, filed away in a folder, and not investigated further. All of this smacked of ordinary police negligence. They missed the obvious, didn't ask the right questions, didn't double-check. The main suspect denied that the girl had entered his apartment. No one was going to verify his words. There were no grounds, no warrant, no suspicions. The man skillfully pretended to be concerned about the girl's disappearance and even helped in the search. He went out with volunteer groups, put up posters, asked acquaintances if they had seen Sonia. He actively inquired about the investigation's progress with the missing girl's family.
When relatives came into the shop where he worked, and they came regularly, the shop was nearby, familiar, he would speak to them with concern and sympathy, offering them candy, free of charge as a sign of support. Sonia's mother would take the candy, thank him, suspecting nothing. When the investigation was reopened in 1996 and the discovery had not yet been made, law enforcement officers spoke with the young man again, as one of the witnesses. This time, the detectives were more insistent, asking tougher questions, not letting him off so easily. No one doubted any longer that Sonia was gone. Too much time had passed. Nevertheless, he managed to divert suspicion from himself again. He answered calmly, didn't stumble, didn't contradict himself. However, it had an effect. The man panicked after they left, realizing the net was closing in, that they might return with a warrant. So he set the fire, after which he fled to Liverpool in the hope of covering his tracks. He thought the fire would destroy the evidence, burn the apartment to the ground. He made a mistake with the arson, which drew even more attention to him and led to the discovery of what had happened. If he had just left quietly, the case might have remained unsolved. But the arson sparked interest, brought the owners to the scene, and made them inspect the property. In late March 1996, traces of blood were found in 2 closets located within the apartment. The stains were old, ingrained, but modern methods allowed them to be analyzed. Later analysis showed that it belonged to the girl. This meant she had been there for some time. Whether she was okay at that point was unknown. Maybe she was kept in the closet, hidden, waiting for darkness. The carpet the landlords talked about had mysteriously disappeared right after Sonia vanished. The owners remembered it had been on the apartment floor, then it was gone. James said he threw it out. It was worn out, he claimed. Furthermore, a metal fire poker with suspicious traces was discovered. It was lying in a corner, behind an old armchair, covered in dust. After examination, it was confirmed this blood belonged to the story's heroine. It was the instrument used in the act. Why the police didn't search the area around the apartment more thoroughly, limiting themselves only to searches of the property inside, remains mystery. A formal inspection, a check mark in the report, no meticulousness. If the man responsible hadn't set fire to the rented accommodation, it's possible the case would have remained unsolved to this day. What remained could have lain there for decades. James was arrested and charged for what happened to Sonia Foresight. As he was being driven away, he was silent, looking out the car window. When what was found was thoroughly analyzed, all samples collected, and all expert examinations completed, it was released to the family. A little over 2 weeks after the discovery of the carpet, the family finally held a service for her. A small procession, few people, quiet sobs. All of this was a real shock for Audrey, but also a kind of relief. She finally knew what had happened to her eldest daughter. Knowing is terrible, but not knowing is even worse. Most relatives of missing persons say that it is psychologically much harder to live in uncertainty, not knowing what happened to a loved one. Hope tortures more than the truth. After these events, the Forsyth family could no longer continue living in their old house, where the terrible event had taken place just around the corner, a couple of 100 meters away. Every time they went outside, they saw that house, that street, and there were too many memories of the girl here, her room, her things, the places where she used to walk. So they moved to another area, farther away. On April 21, 1998, James Craig stood trial for what happened to Sonia Forsyth. The courtroom was packed. There wasn't enough space. People stood in the aisles. The prosecutor presented his version of events. He spoke clearly, methodically, without excessive emotion. This information had been very difficult to obtain, which had dragged out the process for 2 years. There was very little data. What remained had lain for too long. Evidence had faded. Witnesses had forgotten details. They had to gather information piece by piece, bit by bit, reconstructing the picture from fragments. On that fateful evening, Sonia was walking from her house to a friend's and met an older man, James, who somehow caught her attention. Maybe he called out to her, maybe she stopped on her own. They smoked, talked. The young man was charming, spoke easily, joked. He lured her to his home under some pretext, to listen to music, to get something. It didn't matter. There he attacked her. It was presumed the man harmed the girl in the worst way, which was the motive for his actions. Unfortunately, the condition of the discovery was so poor that this theory could not be definitively confirmed. Nothing had been preserved, making analysis impossible. Then, the girl was fatally injured with a fire poker, a heavy, metal one with a sharp end. She was found to have sustained severe injuries to her head, multiple blows, one after another. After the man committed the act, he first hid what remained in a closet. He put it there, closed the door, and waited for night. Only after that, when it got dark and the street was empty, did he wrap her in the carpet, the very one that had been on the floor in the room, and carry her out into the courtyard. He hid her in the coal bunker located at the far end. He closed the door, went back. He behaved as if nothing had happened. Given the time that had passed, there was almost no direct evidence against the man. However, thanks to witness testimony, the neighbor who saw Sonia at the entrance, other people who confirmed James's strange behavior in those days, the prosecution had no doubt that James Craig had committed this horrific atrocity. Plus, there were numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence discovered by the search team. Curiously, the police negligence was barely publicized and went unpunished. No one was held accountable for missing the discovery, for not noticing the smell, for taking the suspect at his word. The topic was hushed up, mentioned in passing, and quickly moved on from. Testifying for the prosecution at the trial was the forensic expert who conducted the examination of what remained, the carpet and the fire poker found in the apartment. He spoke dryly, in scientific language, showing photographs and diagrams. He agreed that the marks on the victim's skull were identical in shape to this tool. They matched in width, depth, and direction of impact. Despite the convincing evidence, Craig insisted he was not responsible for Sonia's fate. He sat calmly, looking straight ahead, occasionally shaking his head. However, the man admitted that on the night of the girl's disappearance, they had accidentally met on the street, and she had asked for a cigarette. They struck up a conversation, as people do. James didn't refuse, took out a pack, and offered her one. They lived in the same area, occasionally saw each other on the streets, in shops, but were not close, so he didn't even know her name. just a girl from a neighboring house. The defendant admitted that after this, Sonia accompanied him to a local pub across the street, a small establishment. Everyone there knew each other. Here, he bought cigarettes for his mother, as well as a couple of cans of beer for himself. A normal purchase, nothing special. He agreed with the neighbor's statement, who had supposedly seen them in front of the apartment.
Yes, they were standing there, smoking, talking. During this time, they smoked some more and finished the beer. The man stated that Sonia walked back with him from the pub, but he denied that the girl had entered his apartment. He insisted she stayed outside. The defendant claimed he said goodbye to her a couple of minutes later at the entrance, and later, when he went out onto the balcony for a smoke, he saw Sonia in the company of two other girls who were sitting on the windowsill of a nearby abandoned house. They were chatting, laughing, as teenagers usually do. James could not explain the presence of the victim's blood in the rented apartment where he lived. He remained silent, shrugged his shoulders, looked at his lawyer. He offered no version of events. According to the prosecution, the defendant was lying, as the forensic expert was able to link the bloodstains found inside the apartment to the DNA samples of the girl's parents. Modern methods left no room for doubt. The traces found in the closet and on the carpet in which what remained was wrapped were identical and also matched the DNA profiles obtained from the victim's biological parents. The probability of error was negligible. The trial lasted for 2 weeks. Witnesses, experts, lawyers, prosecutors, everyone spoke, presented evidence, argued, objected. Fortunately, the jury needed much less time. They went to deliberate and returned half an hour later. It took only half an hour to find James Craig guilty for what happened to Sonia Foresight. The verdict was unanimous. During the final phase of the hearings, the courtroom was overflowing. Everyone wanted to see the finale, hear the verdict, and see justice served. One of the attendees, as the judge was reading the sentence, couldn't hold back and shouted at James, "Burn in hell!" The guards flinched, but the person was quickly quieted down. People were shocked by his cruelty and indifference to what had happened. He sat with a stone face, showing no emotion, not lowering his eyes. One man, who had daughters around the same age as Sonia, wanted to rush at the criminal. He jumped up from his seat and took a step forward. He was only held back from this act by friends who had accompanied him to the courtroom. They grabbed his arms, pulled him back, and persuaded him to sit down. James was sentenced to life in prison, which was a fitting punishment. The judge read the sentence clearly, without hesitation. The courtroom breathed a sigh of relief. After the sentencing, one of the detectives who had been involved in the investigation of the girl's disappearance from the very beginning admitted to journalists that they might have indeed made some mistakes. He said this with difficulty, choosing his words. The errors were related to the fact that initially, Sonia Foresight was considered a missing person and still safe. They were looking for someone who was okay, not what was later discovered. Furthermore, not enough attention was paid to the area around the apartment where the carpet with what remained was found years later. They conducted a superficial inspection, didn't look in the corner, didn't open the bunker door. A standard procedure, but insufficient. Unfortunately, the criminal's story did not end there. To everyone's outrage, James was released from prison in 2019. He had served 23 years and was released on parole. His behavior was exemplary, there were no complaints, and the commission decided to give him a chance. He settled in a hostel for ex-offenders located in Portadown. A small building, security, supervision, but still freedom. After what happened to Sonia, her mother Audrey started a social media page as soon as they became widespread. At first timidly, then more confidently. She posted photos of her daughter, wrote about how much she missed her, how difficult it was. In 2019, the woman wrote a post admitting she struggled to get through each anniversary of her eldest daughter's passing. Every year was the same. Tears, memories, a pain that never goes away. However, that year it was even harder. The man responsible for the terrible act was free. He walked the same streets, breathed the same air. She was horrified that now all the people around him were in mortal danger. She wrote this openly, not mincing words. The woman did not hold back in her expressions when making these posts. She called him a monster, the one responsible, a subhuman. Curiously, even this was not the end of the story. Just 2 years later, James Craig was arrested again. Handcuffs, a car, back to the station. It was discovered that in the late 80s and early 90s, even before what happened to Sonia, he had attacked 2 individuals who were very vulnerable at the time.
He attacked them and attempted to harm them severely in practically the same place, in the same apartment where he later committed the act against Sonia Foresight. The same sofa, the same walls. For this crime, James received an even lighter sentence, a few years, no more. The court argued that these crimes were committed before he was sentenced for what happened to Sonia. Therefore, by law, it could not be considered a relapse. Formally, he was clean at the time of their commission, although morally, he had long been a criminal. Other victims of this monster were also found, whom he had harmed and put in terrible positions in the apartment where the incident with Sonia took place. Those who had now grown up found the courage to speak out. But James denied everything, shaking his head, saying he didn't remember, that it wasn't true. He could not be held accountable for those incidents due to a lack of evidence. Too much time had passed. There was no proof, only his word against theirs.
Just 2 years later, the man was free again. He was released quietly, without much fuss. Back to the hostel, back to supervision, back to life on the outside. The Forsyth family received this news on the 32nd anniversary of their daughter's loss. A cruel coincidence, like a mockery. Her sister, Nikki, was by this time a grown woman with her own family, her own loved ones. She gave an interview in which she stated that it made her sick to think that this man was walking freely on the streets of Belfast, that he could go into a shop, get on a bus, walk past a school. The sister insisted that everyone who sees James should stay away from him and not let him near those they care about. She warned openly, publicly. In her opinion, the law enforcement authorities wouldn't save anyone anyway. They had already failed to save someone once. They wouldn't save anyone again.